So Andrew Yang started a new third party. Of course, he ran for president, and it ran in the Democratic primary, didn't win. Ran for mayor of New York, didn't win, even though he was a big favorite for most of the race. So now he's starting a third party. It's called the Forward Party, and we just got the 6 planks of the Forward Party. So this is the overall philosophy here and policy approach, which will inform the direction of the party. Let's take a look at it. So Dave Weigel says, if it's no longer embargoed, here are the 6 planks of the Forward Party. This is in Andrew Yang's new book, and he lays it out. Number 1, ranked choice voting and open primaries. Now I'll come back and discuss all these. Number 2, fact-based governance. Number 3, human-centered capitalism. Number 4, effective and modern government. Number 5, UBI. And number 6, grace and tolerance. Okay, so let's go through these one by one. Ranked choice voting and open primaries. Am I for or against? I am for. I'm completely in favor of those things. I oftentimes call a third-party approach to politics in the current U.S. system self-disenfranchisement, because the elites and the establishment want nothing more than you to waste all your political energy on a project that's not going to get off the ground. They would love it if anti-establishment energy is wasted on that front. So, but what do I always tell you guys? As long as you don't put the cart before the horse, well, then you can be really effective doing a third-party approach. But the answer is you have to do ranked choice voting first. If you first get ranked choice voting all throughout the U.S., well, then all of a sudden, the third-party approach is no longer self-disenfranchisement. And now it matters, and it's helpful, and you give yourself a fighting chance, whether you run as an independent or a member of a different third party. You actually could make a difference, and it's not like people cannot argue in that situation that there's a spoiler effect, that your vote is wasted on somebody who has no chance. Because if it's ranked choice voting, your vote will just go to, if your candidate and you're voting for third party doesn't even come close to winning, then your vote redirects and goes down the line to your second choice, so on and so forth. So if we implement ranked choice voting everywhere, then the third party approach is no longer self-disenfranchisement. And I think it becomes a lot more practical and a lot more reasonable to put all your energy on that front. So this is an example of, credit to Andrew Yang here, he's not putting the cart before the horse. He's saying, no, we're going to do this in the right order. I'm not going to just self-disenfranchise with a third party that's going to go nowhere. We have to first get ranked choice voting and have open primaries. Okay, great. So I'm in favor of plank number 1. Plank number 2, fact-based governance. I don't know what that means. It's so broad and vague in general. I mean, libertarians argue they do fact-based governance. Socialists argue they do fact-based governance. You can look at a fact and have a totally different interpretation of that fact. So here's a good example. You can have a giant economic downturn, and people on the right will argue, well, one of the reasons for this downturn is the big money government stimulus package that we just passed. It is actively hurting the economy and increasing our debt and leading to inflation, and that's unacceptable. Then you have people on the left who could look at that same economic downturn and say, the problem with this economic downturn is we didn't do a stimulus that was nearly big enough. Our stimulus was too small. If it was bigger, we would have created more jobs, created more opportunity, given the working class more capital so that they can live their lives, and it would have helped the economy more. So, in other words, you could look at the same set of facts and come to wildly different conclusions based on those facts. So when you say fact-based governance, that's too broad, that's too general, because ideology necessarily has a role to play, no matter who you are. Nobody's free of ideology in politics, and if you are, you're a dumbass. Like, you have to have some sort of perspective. You have to have some sort of filter and model through which you view the world. There is no such thing as like, no, I'm actually above it all, and ideology is not a thing to me. There is no such thing as non-ideological. It's a farce. So when you say fact-based governance, that doesn't make much sense. That's too vague, that's too broad, that's too general, and it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, it's easy for people to look at this and say, I'm pro-facts. But everybody thinks they're pro-facts. What, maybe 10 or 20% of people are silly enough and open and honest enough to be like, no, I'm against facts. I don't believe in facts. I don't even know if that's true. But even if it is, 80% of people think, yeah, of course I'm basing everything off facts. So I don't know what that means, and that's kind of silly. The third thing, human-centered capitalism. I don't know about that, dog. Because, okay, so there's a number of ways to interpret this. One of the things I'll say is this. If you really believed in human-centered capitalism, you could argue human-centered capitalism is actually social democracy. Like, that's what the Swedish or Norwegian model is. That's what the Scandinavian model is in a variety of those countries. And I say that because there are still elements of capitalism in those countries, but it's just a better hybrid with socialism. There is more socialism in those countries, so certain things are taken off the table. Now, I'm very sympathetic to social democracy, as everybody knows. But that leads me to ask Andrew Yang, well, why wouldn't you just say social democracy is what we're advocating for? And if his response is, well, I don't really believe in social democracy, then I say to you, well, what the hell is human-centered capitalism then? What does that mean? What does human-centered capitalism mean? Because there also is an argument. Now, let me put on my further lefty hat here for a second. There's also an argument that that's a contradiction in terms. It's not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because capitalism, by its very nature, is not geared towards the flourishing of human beings. I mean, the goal of capitalism is increased profit for the corporations that are partaking in it, for the businesses that are partaking in it. And as Noam Chomsky famously says, under this conception of the world, private vices yield public benefit. And that just doesn't happen. If you put the profit first and foremost, then the human beings definitionally come second, or even further down the list, third, fourth, whatever it might be. So, not even sure human-centered capitalism, as he might define it, is possible. And namely because this, and I've talked about this with him. He came on Crystal Kyle and Friends, and we gave him a bunch of difficult questions. And one of the things I pointed out is during his presidential campaign, he wanted to put sunset provisions on all government regulations, and so we have to revisit them every 5 years or 10 years or whatever it was. That's a terrible idea, and that would not be human-centered capitalism. That would be like right-wing libertarianism, sort of flirting with an Ayn Rand type effect on that front, and that the results of that would be disastrous. So human-centered capitalism, I don't really know what that means. Maybe you can make an argument it's social democracy, but I don't think he would say it's social democracy if you ask him more detail on it. So then that leaves us with just this, again, a vague notion of like, reform, but don't reform too much. I don't know, man. Maybe in some ways we need to reform a lot. And we need to sort of upend the way the system is done and do a page one rewrite and start from scratch on certain fronts. Because, and here's one more point on this, which is human-centered capitalism, that to me is too concrete because it sort of shuts the door on more elements of democracy in the workplace. So more worker-owned co-ops, more egalitarianism in the workplace. Because we do have this contradiction in American life, which is we espouse the virtues of democracy, but the place where we spend most of our waking time in the workplace, it's a tyranny. It's a dictatorship. It's a rigid hierarchy where you have the owner at the top and then the boss underneath them and then the workers underneath them. And whatever they tell you to do, you have to do within reason. And it's like, well, that's not democracy. You can't say politically democracy is great, but in the business place, it's always terrible. And human-centered capitalism sort of shuts the door on more elements of workplace democracy. And I think we could use some more elements of workplace democracy. I think that's a very nuanced conversation to get into and a complex conversation. I have a lot more to say about it, so we'll shut the door on that for now. But human-centered capitalism shuts the door on further workplace democracy, and I'm not a big fan of that. I think we should leave the door open in some ways to more democracy in the workplace. All right. Then he says, takes home the vague first prize. I mean, this is effective in modern government. That's the number 4 thing. Again, I don't know what that means. Effective in modern government. If I'm being kind, my interpretation of that would be you need to like keep up with the times and don't let technology outpace the needs of the people. So you can't just have, because he was big on this in his presidential campaign, don't let the job automation take away the best paying jobs from U.S. workers. And you have to have a way to transition into this new economy where it's more technological, and we can't just sit idly by and let the automation crush the American people. That's my kind of interpretation of what he's saying there, and that is true, that we need to not let that happen, but to just broadly say effective and modern government, again, this is one of those ones where I think everybody would say, I believe in effective and modern government. You could get a hardcore right-winger who would say, of course I think we should have effective and modern government. You know what I mean? So, very vague. All right, the fifth one, universal basic income. Totally agree with him on this. The only asterisk I would put is it would need to be crystal clear that we're not trying to cut any of the current social safety net programs with the UBI. The UBI should be supplemental on top of our current social safety net programs. So, and to be fair, when I asked Andrew Yang in our podcast with him, he said very clearly, I don't want to cut the social safety net. I want UBI to be on top of it. Okay, fair enough. There was a debate and an argument and about whether or not that was true beforehand and how he crafted it and created the policy, but he did say to me he wants UBI on top of the social safety net program. So number 5, like number 1, I'm totally in favor of. And then number 6, he said we want to, one of their planks is grace and tolerance. I assume that just means general equality. He wants it to be a big tent in the sense that you have in all different races and different genders and stuff like that. I have no problem with grace and tolerance. Grace and tolerance are wonderful things, but again, I do think it's a little overly broad and should be more specific. Now, I'm sure that Andrew Yang does give more specifics on all of these things in his book, but you guys know, and I've said this before in the previous segment, the reason why I'm not too hot on this project, I mean, there's a number of reasons, but he's a very unique individual with his own very unique ideology, and I don't think it is a movement-building ideology. I don't think that this is what sparks millions and millions more people to create a winning coalition to take over U.S. politics. I think ultimately what will happen is he will, even though he's saying, I want to do ranked choice voting everywhere first. That's great. He's right about that. But I don't think they'll get there on that front. So ultimately he will be sort of taking 2% or 3% and just playing with his little 2% or 3% on his own. And that is functionally self-disenfranchisement, whether or not he realizes it. So, and again, it's not like this stuff hasn't been tried before, guys, in terms of like a new third-party movement. They tried it. Remember the Reform Party? Trump was involved with the Reform Party. This was back when I was a child. There have been attempts at this before. Like, we'll have a real third-party movement with a lot of energy behind it, and it always peters out. And I think we're going to see a similar thing with this. The planks I like are number 1 and number 5. All the other ones are very vague in general. And I just don't think it's enough to generate a movement and to make a real impact. And like I told you guys, there are aspects of Andrew Yang I really like. He wants to decriminalize all drugs. That was to the left of Bernie Sanders. UBI I love. But there's other things that I think were not great at all, that I think were really terrible. And that stuff is going to matter. And here's another example. $15 minimum wage. He's against it. He's against it because, like I said, in some ways he's more libertarian on economics than somebody like myself is. I think that's a fair comment. And he's not for $15 minimum wage. He was horrendous on Israel-Palestine and a bunch of foreign policy questions. So, is there enough of a personality and a leadership and an ideology there to spark a true movement that can last and that can change American politics with our terrible two-party system where you have Coke and Pepsi? And he's trying to start RC Cola and take over? I don't think it's going to happen, Andrew. I really don't. And I think that a lot of the enthusiasm that was around him originally, I do think a lot of it has sort of tapered off, because even some of his biggest fans were really turned off by certain takes he had, including the Israel-Palestine one was the big one. That was the real turning point in the mayor race, and that was the big turning point for a lot of people who were big Andrew Yang stans. You just can't be that bad on foreign policy and cheer on the, destruction of Gaza and pretend like Israel's the victim and then have, outsiders love you. That's not an outsider perspective. That is the ultimate pro-establishment insider perspective. And so, even though in some ways I like Andrew Yang, I do think this is sort of doomed to fail. But needless to say, I'll be keeping my eye on it.